Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Local History Live for another week. Hopefully, you survived the weekend and didn't get buried too badly. And I know a lot of folks don't watch this live, but we're here on Tuesday. And we're still digging out here at 3 in the afternoon on Tuesday. Some people are still digging out. But things are starting to melt, and the temperatures are starting to get into the 40s, so that will be a blessing and a curse, of course, because the snow melts, but it also comes crashing down. So we still have to be careful. But a lot of people on Facebook and social media are talking, of course, about the weather. And that got me to thinking about the history of weather, the history of snowstorms in particular in our communities. And I've seen some things on Facebook and some of the Facebook groups that have made me kind of cringe because they're making statements about how this storm relates to history and other storms that have come before us, and some statements have been made out there in social media land that aren't necessarily true. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But again, hoping everyone's okay out there. And I think here in East Aurora, depending on whether you're in the village or out in the more rural areas, more than 5 feet of snow. Of course, Orchard Park and Hamburg got a lot more than us, actually, and Elma got quite a bit too. But it got me to thinking, because there were a couple folks on social media comparing this to the 2014 storm, which coincidentally happened on the very same day. It was kind of eerie to look at, and I posted on social media on Saturday. I had ventured up to Main Street to take a picture of the exact picture I took following the 2014 storm, and then comparing that exact picture of Main Street to a storm around 1900. And actually, that's kind of interesting, because I'm not sure, perhaps the storm from 1900, that image was also from November. So that might be interesting. There's no exact date on that original picture. I will post that on the comments of this video, so you can see that if you didn't catch it on social media when I posted it on Saturday. But it was kind of interesting to see the difference in similarity of how Main Street looked after these storms. A lot of people have been comparing this storm to 2014, and it had a very similar pattern, lake effect pattern, setting up over the South Towns, sitting over the South Towns for hours and hours and hours and hours, and then making its way north into the North Towns, and then coming back down into the South Towns, and then going into the southern tier. And that's exactly what happened with the storm in 2014. And it's quite interesting that it happened not only the exact same way, but almost the exact same timing. Kind of interesting. The storm hit the same day, the sun came out the next day, and then we got more snow later that evening and into the next day. So it was kind of interesting how that worked. History in this case did repeat itself, which was quite interesting. But that got me thinking, because some people were basically talking about how this is a new thing, how we have not had storms like this before, and that's just not true. And actually, it was quite interesting. I had found a while back in my research an article, a headline actually, from a Buffalo newspaper, and that's what I used as the teaser for today. I posted yesterday about the village of East Aurora being buried in the snow. And this headline, they said village is practically buried. But at the time this was published, November 15th, the storm was of 1900. The headline was published, the village was being buried by snow, and it had already gotten 5 feet of snow, and there was more coming. So, and this was November. So this is a very interesting thing, that this isn't a new phenomena. And what tends to happen is we would get a very warm late fall, which we had this year, and then the lake is very warm, and then the first time, or very early in the season, a cold air front will come across the lake, and we get a whopper of a storm, and a very localized storm. And that's what happened here in 1900. It basically was from Olean, East Aurora, Southern Tier, South Towns, Orchard Park, Hamburg. Again, history repeating itself. But nature hasn't really changed a whole lot either. We do talk about global warming and the changes that's happened, but the idea of how the lakes impact our snow, that's all stayed the same for a very long time. So when you think about the history of weather, the patterns are the same. So it's not as if some sort of new pattern of weather got invented in the 1950s or 1960s or something. No. So when you're looking at weather patterns in the past, think about it from a standpoint of how the weather is today. The only difference is how we react to the weather. But there have been early season and late season storms that seem to get most of the attention. A blizzard or a storm in January, February, it's not really out of the ordinary. And very deep cold temperatures, we're just used to that. But it's when it's either in November, October, November, or in April, sometimes even May, March. We've had several big storms in March, and those tend to get the headlines. But what's very interesting is that we talk about the blizzard of 77. Some of us will talk about other storms. Blizzard of 77 gets the attention because it was more widespread, impacted a much larger area, not the localized lake effect snow that was what happened in 2014 and the one this last weekend. But there's been storms since the beginning of time. And actually, as I was doing research for an article about weather, there's been a couple that have come out that have been pretty substantial and pretty noteworthy. That November 1900 storm, what's very interesting about that one is very similar to what's happening now. That big headline that we were buried under snow, the following week, the Advertiser just had a little note about it and said, the snow had already started melting and people were getting back to their business. So it really impacted them the community for a few days, and then they moved on. And that's what we're trying to do now, right? So similar in that way. And there's another notable storms. March 1936, there was a lot of snow dumped on East Aurora and surrounding areas. The worst part of that storm in 1936, a late season March storm, was that there was essentially a warm front that came through right after, melted all the snow, flooded the west end. So it wasn't the storm itself that caused problems. It was what happened afterwards and the melting of the snow very quickly after that. And there was another storm in April of 1894, which is very interesting. And it's the interesting part I thought was that the Advertiser, the East Aurora Advertiser, it wasn't like a headline on the front page of of the East Aurora Advertiser. It was just a little note inside. And the reason I looked this one up, April 11th, 1894, is because I think it was April of last year, maybe the year before, we had gotten snow on that date, and apparently it was the snowiest April day in Buffalo, and one of the meteorologists on TV mentioned it. So I'm like, oh, I'm going to go back and look in the Advertiser and see if they said anything about it. And they basically just put a little note in the paper that said, just make a note that the heaviest snowstorm in April for over 20 years fell on Tuesday and Wednesday, the 10th and the 11th. Fully 2 feet of unusually heavy wet snow fell, which settled rapidly. The most damage was done to trees and telegraph wires. A few roofs were damaged. Or injured. They use the word injured. The cause of the heavy snow is said to be the meeting of east and westbound storms over this state. Again, 1894, these big storms are nothing new. And then 1930, there was a big storm that came through in October. And we remember the October storm that fell, and the reason that was a big deal was a lot fell in a short period of time. We still had a lot of leaves on the trees, and a lot of time back I remember, reporting on it when I worked at the East Aurora Advertiser, and people were talking about it being unprecedented. Yes, it was, but we have had October storms before. Actually, the October 23rd, 1930 issue of the East Aurora Advertiser talked about one of the worst snowstorms in decades in October. 20 inches of snow was followed by another 14 inches according to the newspaper. So these are just a couple of the storms that we've had before. So when you hear that, we've never, that we feel, and sometimes it feels that way because when you're in the middle of it, that this is something new, unprecedented. Our forefathers and mothers have put up with storms like this for a very long time. The only difference is and we've noticed it. I think we've noticed it in our lifetimes, even maybe in the past 10 years, is I really think we're better prepared because we have better forecasting of the storms. Imagine in the 1800s, you had a storm with several feet of snow, even 1900. There was no radio. There was no TV. There was no internet. There was no radar to pick up what was happening. Yes, there were meteorologists and scientists who were coming up with the forecasts, but even if they had the best forecasts and they knew a storm was coming, getting the word out to the people was very difficult, if not impossible. You could telegraph something to East Aurora, but word had to get around and to people out in the rural areas. You didn't have your phone with the radar that you could look up every 5 minutes. So when we talk about the same exact storm could hit in 1900 and hit today, and we are much better prepared for it today because we just know it's coming. A lot of times they didn't even know the storm was coming. Also, I was thinking about this during this storm, but particularly during 2014, and to a limited extent, the October storm back in the mid-2000s, was just our cell phones and how different that was. People were stuck on highways during the blizzard of 77, and they couldn't call home. So you think about that, like at least if you're stuck now during a snowstorm, you can get on your cell phone and let someone know you're okay. Still a terrible situation, but just having a cell phone in your car today changes the dynamic of a snowstorm and how we react to it. And then, of course, we have better equipment to clean up after a storm. So there's a lot. Technology changes from the beginning of the forecast all the way to how we clean up has changed how we adapt to snowstorms. And one of the things that I found interesting in the newspapers when I was going through is how we take for granted maybe today how we can get around during the winter. And actually there was an article in the March 11th, 1920 East Aurora Advertiser that was talking about something, a truck coming through East Aurora on its way to bring supplies somewhere. And they were coming through East Aurora, and they were and it was an army truck, and they were talking about the difficulty of getting down Seneca Street from Buffalo. And they were coming through East Aurora. And I'm like, well, that's no big deal. Why would you, Seneca Street today, that Seneca Street's been there for a very long time. One of the oldest streets we've had to get to Buffalo. Well, what I didn't realize is they were talking about how the reason this was a big deal was that Seneca Street had been, and this was March of 1920. So January, February, March. Seneca Street was buried for weeks. There was even if you had cars, it was 1920, so people would start having cars. You couldn't drive to Buffalo on Seneca Street. Today we plow it and we complain if it's not plowed, but back then they didn't bother plowing it, or they couldn't plow it. The trains would go from East Aurora to Buffalo, and that's how a lot of passengers would get from one place to another, or supplies would get from Buffalo down here and vice versa. But the Seneca Street was completely blocked with snow for weeks. Not just a night, or they didn't just have a driving ban for one night or 24 hours. It was for weeks. And I didn't even realize that until I read this. And it wasn't even like it's a headline on it saying that Seneca Street was closed. It was just sort of part of everyday life. And that was just in 1920. I just sometimes when I start thinking about how we complain about the weather a little bit, or we might complain a little too much about the cleanup efforts, which have been wonderful, I think, during this storm particularly. Our local DPWs and highway departments have cleaned up from this storm remarkably well, given how much snow we've gotten. But every time I get sort of, maybe a little depressed or thinking about how horrible a storm is, I think about what it would have been like before the technology we have today. Even when you think about people being basically snowed in. We talk about having been snowed in over this past weekend, but even 50 years ago, and definitely 100 years ago and 150 years ago, folks who lived right in our small communities, especially the people in rural areas, they were snowed in. There was no way out. And unless you sleighed. Some people use the sleigh to get places. A lot of people use the sleigh. But the weather really impacted your life. There'd be weeks where you wouldn't go anywhere because there was no way to get there or an easy way to get there. So I like to think that the idea of being snowed in is a lot different today than it was in the past. And so when you study history and you're reading something about somebody, weather is definitely a big part of the context to look at when we're studying history, because if an event that happened in February during a snowstorm certainly was different than an event in the summer. So if someone even passed away in February in the middle of a snowstorm or in the middle of winter, that would have much different impact on the family than would be if it were in the summertime. And there were better communication and more roads open and things like that. So just weather is a big part of the context of history. As much as things have changed and how we get out and about more, and another thing is too, I always never take for granted the television, the internet, if radio, all those things. 1800s, you were snowed in without those things. You would read essentially, and it would be really, really quiet. One day I had like nothing on in the house. I had the TV off, and it was so super quiet. You could hear the ticking of the clocks, and I was like, wow, this is kind of eerie. We're not used to it. But then it came to my head that, oh wait, this is what it used to be like. There was no sound in your house unless it was created by people. So there was no television. Today we just turn the TV on out of habit. So when you were snowed in and there was a storm like we had over the weekend, without television, without the Bills game to watch on TV, or the internet to scroll around on, much different. Now, mind you, they didn't know what they were missing because it hadn't been invented yet, but I always just keep that in mind when I think, oh goodness, we're snowed in. It means a whole lot. It's a whole different thing today. Given that, though, that there's a lot of things that are different about today's snowstorms versus ones in the past, a lot of things have not changed. And in fact, there's been, there was an article I came across, and I'm just going to read it because I find it interesting. We always have in our community this debate over sidewalks, right? And people are in the village are required technically by law, and it's a courtesy you're responsible for shoveling your own sidewalk in front of your house or your business. The village has a sidewalk plow that goes around, and there's a whole history with that too. It did start off as a plow, a horse-drawn plow that went around the community streets, and then in the 1960s, they having trouble finding horses and drivers, they got a mechanical plow for the sidewalks. So we've had a sidewalk plow in the community for a long, long time. But forever too, for a very long time, people have been technically, even though the village does this service, responsible for the conditions of their sidewalks. And I heard one person say, I think it was on social media once, that people today are just discourteous, and they don't take care of their sidewalks like people used to. Well, then that's why I found it funny when I found an article in the February 26, 1892 Easter Advertiser that noted that it has been noticed that during the past winter, the men who left the snow on their sidewalks the most, and whose walks were therefore in the worst condition, were men who have the reputation of being the wealthiest in town. It would be well if they would distribute some of their wealth among the poor ones by hiring them to clean the walks. That was 1892. So the debate and the arguments over whether people should be plowing and shoveling their sidewalks is age-old. That's not a new problem. People are not less discourteous today than they were back then, because apparently has always been a problem with people not shoveling their sidewalks, and that was from the Easter Advertiser in 1892. And one of the last points I want to make, and if anyone has any questions, please feel free. Okay. Oh, Libby's saying that it's buffering. Yeah. The internet's been weird the past couple days, so all I can say is just come back and watch us later, and I'll make sure that we're were on appropriately. Okay. Okay, if you're buffering, I'm just gonna, yep, just come back on later, and we'll be hopefully okay because it will be recording it. I can't do anything more about the internet. Again, the internet is a blessing that we have it, frankly, from a historical standpoint, but we also have to put up with sometimes when it's slow. So hopefully everybody can hear me. All right. Okay, thank you, Sarah. I'm going to keep going. So, as we were talking about the differences in and then similarities, the one last point I kind of want to make, unless you have any questions about the weather, is saw on Facebook people were kind of complaining. Not kind of. Someone actually, well, actually, a few people were alluding to it, and then some people were downright rude, I think, about the Postal Service. And the post office has been struggling during this storm. We haven't had mail delivered, and actually, I think the East Aurora Post Office has actually been closed due to the mail not coming in, and there was actually an issue with the roof, I heard. So with the snow weight on the roof, so the building actually was closed off. And then someone was pointing out, people on Facebook were talking about, oh, when are we going to get our mail? One person even said, this is ridiculous. We haven't had mail in days. And then someone posted, well, whatever happened to that old motto of the Postal Service, neither snow nor rain nor heat nor gloom of night keeps them from their completed rounds. That's a great motto, but it isn't true. And it actually, that motto, it's quite funny, goes back to ancient times about couriers. They borrowed that. That's not a new Postal Service motto. That goes back to a Greek historian, and it was talking about old ancient couriers who would deliver messages. But the idea that the Postal Service guarantees that there's going to be mail delivered in all types of weather is not necessarily a true statement. And for good reason. And someone had made the point of, back in the old days, the good old days, the mail would have been delivered. And that's just simply not true. You look at the old reports of storms that happen, especially even storms with only a couple feet. And that's kind of funny that we're saying that it's just a couple feet rather than a lot of, 8 feet. The trains would not get through. Trains were stopped in Buffalo. Sometimes they'd make it to West Seneca and they'd get stopped. And without the trains, there was no mail, and there was no mail delivered. So this idea that in the old days, yes, we had delivery of mail twice a day in the old days. The post office, we had more post offices in smaller, areas. You would go to the post office, pick up your mail. Mail was actually with postcards and things. We have the internet today. Mail was actually, in many respects, more important for day-to-day communication. But the idea that in the old days the mail carriers would have made it through a storm, and for some reason they can't do it today, but they were able to do it in the old days, it's just not true. Newspaper reports would say that the mail was stopped, the trains didn't get through, so East Aurora had the Pennsylvania Railroad go through it, and a big part of that their service was the mail, and the mail would come from Buffalo and be dropped at the post office, and if the trains couldn't get through with the mail on them, then you couldn't get your mail. So I kind of cringed when I saw those statements on Facebook complaining about the mail service, and I thought, well, it is a storm, and yeah, I think everyone's doing the best they can. But to compare it and say, to history and say what's wrong with modern day post office. They do things differently today, but their reaction to the weather is the same. And the idea that we should expect, I don't know, there's a lot of things that are important that are delivered in the mail, but to expect essentially a miracle to get the mail over, 5-6 feet of snow when we haven't even been able to dig out. To expect a mail carrier to get through that and to go down streets that sometimes don't have sidewalks plowed out yet. I just that doesn't happen today. That's kind of a high expectation today, and it would have been the same in the 1930s. It would have been the same in the 1890s. To get your mail during a weather event like this would have been kind of unrealistic to say that. So that was a point I wanted to make about the weather and how it impacts. We have this romanticized history, idea of history again. You'll hear me, I sound like a broken record when I say that, but sometimes we look back at history and be like, oh, things were better. The mail was delivered twice a day back then, and they would have made it through the storm. No, they didn't. And the newspapers validate that. Validate that the mail, the trains, transportation. Again, Seneca Street was blocked for weeks. We don't think of it that way, and we forget those little tidbits and those little details about history that affected daily life. And when we forget about those, it makes it sound like things were better back then and more efficient, when in fact they were dealing with the same kind of things that we are today, just in a different way. Lastly, I want to just make a point about journaling again. I'm a broken record about this too. There's a couple journals that we have in the archives at the town that one of the biggest things we like to talk about the weather, right? It's a conversation starter, I think, because number one, it impacts everybody. It's such a big impact on our daily life, and it always has been. We don't, as much as it's today, we have some differences on how we can deal with the weather and how it's forecast better. It still impacts our life incredibly. Again, in a short period of time last week, we went from just living our daily life to having things closed and schools closed and works closed and streets clogged. It just impacts and it impacts everything about our daily lives. And so it's something that historically speaking, when you're thinking about history and studying history, the weather, an event happening during a weather, it's important to take note of what the weather is. So, but we don't. It's interesting in the National Weather Service has statistics, but those statistics are for a specific area. Today, it's the airport where they take official readings, and they had other locations throughout history that they take the readings so that they'll get the official temperatures, the official everything. But as you all know, and as we said, the weather can be much different here in the village of East Aurora than it is up on the hills of Colden or out in Holland. So journals we have, one of the first things they say in the journal from the 1800s is, what the weather was like today. So sometimes when I hear about a historic weather event, like some of the ones we discussed, several feet of snow, I'll be like, oh, I wonder what, Miss Persons felt about it, or Mr. Bragg, who kept a journal for almost his entire life. And you'll look in, and sure enough, he'll have a thing about a little note about the weather and how they stayed inside all day. And that's how we know, and how it impacted them. So, the newspaper would cover a little bit about what was, immediately cover things that were happening within the village. But because there wasn't you couldn't just pick up the phone and call the village. What life was like up on the hills, and the weather up there, is equally important. And so keeping a journal, and so your perspective, even today, we have all the pictures on Facebook, and we have the weather reports, and the Weather Channel was in East Aurora covering this, and of course there was some, it's true, I'm not exaggerating, they do hype it up. So it's hard to know if anybody were going back to look at the weather report back then, in 100 years, looking at the video of this, a perspective of what it was like on your street. I know the day after the storm, our street everybody was out cleaning up, and I wrote about it in my journal. And so hopefully in 100 years, if someone looks back on these storms like we are doing today, they'll have an appreciation of what we went through, and maybe they won't feel as bad and about their storm, because they can look back on our storm and realize we went through the exact same thing here in 2022. And hopefully they'll have better forecasting and be better prepared, even better prepared for a storm than we are even today. So again, keep those journals coming. And I'm glad you're back, Libby. Again, if you have any problems with the internet connection, just come back later and watch it later. I've had a couple people tell me that with their internet connections. If I had the power over the internet, I wouldn't be wouldn't be sitting here. No offense to anybody here, but if I had power to make the internet perfect, I'd be doing something else with my life and career. So if there's no more questions, I hope everyone's staying safe and with the cleanup. And thank you for listening. And I hope you all have a great Thanksgiving. And again, I will post some of the articles that I was referencing in the comments after we're done. Thank you very much and have a good week.